In 2009, the Chronicle of Higher Education published an essay called 50 Years of Stupid Grammar Advice. The article was written by Jeff Pullum, who's a linguist at the University of Edinburgh. He's also an active blogger for the terrific blog Language Log, and if you haven't already checked it out, I encourage you to do so, as well as for the equally terrific blog Lingua Franca for the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I should disclose here that I also blog for Lingua Franca. Jeff is not known for pulling his punches, especially when it comes to Strunk and White's Elements of Style. The essay that Jeff wrote was published a day after the 50th anniversary of that book. It was first published on April 16th, 1959. And as the title of his essay makes clear, his article was far from celebratory. Jeff concedes that some of the style advice in Strunk and White is fine, if not especially revolutionary. Advice like, be clear, yes, always a good idea, and omit needless words. Of course, the question is always figuring out which ones are needless. Jeff's concern is what he considers to be bad grammar advice. And grammar and style are not always clearly distinguished in Strunk and White. Central to Jeff's case is the treatment of the passive voice in Strunk and White. This entire lecture will focus on the passive voice, and Strunk and White seems like a good place to start. So let's dive in. The relevant section in Elements of Style is called Use Active Voice. And it's going to become important that it is about using the active voice, not about not using the passive voice. So it's called Use the Active Voice, and then Strunk and White give us the following advice. And here I'll quote. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive. This rule does not, of course, mean that the writer should entirely discard the passive voice, which is frequently convenient and sometimes necessary. The habitual use of the active voice, however, makes for forcible writing. So that's Strunk and White on the passive, and I have to say that the leeway in this advice is really important. The passive is sometimes convenient or necessary. And as we'll talk about, the passive is also highly conventionalized in scientific writing and some other kinds of academic prose. Where Strunk and White run into trouble is that their examples potentially could confuse people about what is passive and what is not. Strunk and White provide 4 example sentences, and only one of them is passive, as I'll show you. Now, Strunk and White introduce the sentences by saying that they show, and here I'll quote, how a transitive verb in the active voice can improve a sentence. So really, Strunk and White have 2 things going on here in this advice, transitive verbs and active voice. But given that the whole section is called Use Active Voice and is about active voice, I think the transitive verb part can get lost. Let me give you the 4 sentences that are in Strunk and White in this section on using the active voice. First, there were a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground. Second, at dawn, the crowing of a rooster could be heard. Third, the reason that he left college was that his health became impaired. Fourth, it was not long before she was very sorry that she had said what she had. As I'm sure many of you caught, only the second sentence there is passive. At dawn, the crowing of a rooster could be heard. And we can see one of the ways in that sentence that the passive can create what I'll call stylistic stumbles. We don't know who in that sentence is doing the hearing. The passive in this sentence has inserted some odd, unknown agent who's hearing the rooster, as opposed to just saying, the rooster crowed at dawn. And then we just assume that whoever heard it, heard it. So let's pause and just make sure we're all on the same page about what the passive is. Let's start with an active sentence. Here you get subject, verb, object, where the subject is the agent, the person or thing doing the verb, and then the object is the thing or person who or which is acted upon. Passive, that object, and in English it can actually be a direct object or an indirect object, gets fronted in the sentence. Then the verb is transformed to take an auxiliary be, and then the main verb is put into the past participle. The subject is moved to the end, and you put a by in front of it to create a prepositional phrase. That prepositional phrase, by plus subject, also becomes optional. An example. The active, Big Bird tickled Cookie Monster. If we turn it into the passive, Cookie Monster was tickled by Big Bird. And I have to just explain here why these sentences came to mind. When I was an undergraduate, I worked in a language lab where we were studying how early kids learned the passive voice. And these were the sentences we were using, and kids were looking at monitors with a Cookie Monster and a Big Bird, and Cookie Monster was tickling Big Bird, and we were trying to see when they started understanding passive voice. So, to keep going with my passive voice examples, you can take a passive construction and add aspect. For example, let's add the progressive to our sentence about Big Bird and Cookie Monster. Big Bird, here's the active, Big Bird is tickling Cookie Monster. And then to make it passive, Cookie Monster is being tickled by Big Bird. The point is that the recipient of the action becomes the subject, and the agent moves to the end and becomes optional. The optionality of the agent is very helpful when we don't want to take responsibility for an action. Think about the famous statement, mistakes were made by someone who remains unnamed. We could take a more quotidian example at home where you say, the red shirt was put in with the whites in that load of laundry. The red shirt was put in with the whites. No one is taking responsibility for that red shirt getting in there. The fact that we can leave out the agent in a passive is also helpful when we don't know who's responsible. Think about a sentence like, my car was sideswiped in the parking lot. I don't know who sideswiped it. If I wanted to make it active, I would have to say something like, someone sideswiped my car in the parking lot. Or more likely, I would probably say, some turkey sideswiped my car in the parking lot. But it is an unidentified someone or turkey. You can also think about a sentence like, he was murdered. We don't know who murdered him. If you wanted to make that active, you'd have to say something like, someone murdered him with that indefinite pronoun as your subject. Going back then to Strunk and White. What is happening in these other Strunk and White sentences if it's not the passive? What we're seeing in all of these sentences is the insertion of to be as a main verb where you don't need it, where it probably weakens the clout of the verb and often adds extra words to the sentence. Let's review each sentence in turn. Number 1, there were a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground. This is just a pretty straightforward to be sentence, and the be became necessary when we added the introductory there. The there we often call existential there. There were a great number of leaves lying on the ground. So now we have two verbs in the sentence. We have the were in there were, and then we have the verbs lying on the ground. These kinds of there constructions are quite frequent in speech. But in writing, they're worth watching, as there were, which focuses our attention on what's about to come, also arguably adds extra words. Maybe call them needless words. You can see why Strunk and White don't like this sentence. Is there a way that we can make lie or some other descriptive verb the main verb of the sentence? For example, dead leaves covered the ground. You'll notice that in that rewrite, I also got rid of a great number because the verb covers, to me, captures that there are a great number of leaves. Let's now look at sentence number 3 from Strunk and White. The reason that he left college was that his health became impaired. This sentence raises much of the same issue as the first sentence. The phrasing, the reason that X is Y, introduces to be as the main verb. And it is worth looking at whether, in context, we can just use a because construction instead. Can we say, he left college because his health became impaired? Now, you'll notice that in those two sentences, there is a shift in emphasis. And that's why I said you'd want to make sure you were rewriting this in context. It is really about whether we're emphasizing that he left college or why he left college. Let's imagine that I'm talking to someone who thinks that he, whoever he is, just quit college. And I want to emphasize that there was a reason. And so I say, no, the reason that he left college is... You can see how in context that wording works. Now the fourth sentence in Strunk and White. It was not long before she was very sorry that she had said what she had. Okay, there's a lot going on in this sentence. More than we probably need, I think. It was not long. Well, that could become soon or quickly. But again, I'm going to say that that will depend on what the writer wants to emphasize. If we say, it was not long before she did X, that's not exactly the same rhetorically or semantically as she quickly did X. Then we have the phrasing, she was very sorry, which could become she regretted. Really, that's a word choice issue that depends what verb you choose. Then we have the last part, she had said what she had, which could probably become she said what she did, or she regretted her words. We need a little more context to rewrite that sentence. You can now see why putting all 4 of these sentences under the advice, use active voice, becomes potentially confusing, particularly in terms of equating all uses of to be as a main verb with the passive voice. And that is Jeff Pullum's concern. I don't think the concern is unfounded, given what I have seen in classrooms at all levels, where sentences like number 1 and 3 and 4, where you have to be as a main verb, are getting identified as passives. As I've talked about, all of these sentences could probably benefit from some revision, but not because they are all in the passive voice. It is good advice that every time we use the verb to be as a main verb in our writing, that we go back and look at those and see if there is some more dynamic or evocative verb that we could use instead. This may simultaneously change the syntax of the sentence, sometimes in good ways. So that advice of be careful about those to be verbs is worth heeding. It's not that there's anything grammatically wrong with be as a main verb, but stylistically, you may be able to do better, at least some of the time. You may be able to avoid repetition. In part, it's because we use be a lot as a main verb in speech, and so it can get into our writing as a very frequent main verb, and getting it out of there so that you don't have too many sentences with to be as a main verb is good. It can also be good in terms of concision. As I showed you in rewriting some of those sentences, when you took out the to be verb, the sentence sometimes tightened up. So what is better advice about the passive? Here's what I would say. In every instance, consider whether a passive construction is the most rhetorically effective choice. I'm not just being wishy-washy here. There are several reasons why it might be the best choice rhetorically, why you might want to use the passive, and I'm going to outline those reasons here. Before I do, let's look at some of the passives you probably should rewrite because they are not rhetorically effective. Here's the kind of sentence that I have to say I do see in student writing fairly often. I think sometimes the passive gets in there because students are trying to be more formal and somehow the passive feels more formal. Here is two sentences. The second one is passive. The exam began. The shuffling of paper was heard in the room. Again, like the rooster sentence, we have this odd unnamed hearer who has suddenly been introduced into the picture, who's hearing the shuffling. We could just change this sentence to something like, the shuffling of paper filled the room. Here's another example of a sentence in the passive that is not great. A more streamlined process was envisioned by the committee. That sentence is probably better if we let the committee be the subject. The committee envisioned a more streamlined process. But I am going to say that it depends on exactly where that sentence is in a paragraph and what it's trying to do. Let me explain. There are times where, to maintain continuity from sentence to sentence, the passive helps us. To show you what I mean here, I'm going to talk about the opening two sentences from a blog post that I wrote a few months ago. The first sentence of the blog post was, I have a new favorite mug, which was true. Then my second sentence was, it was given to me by graduate students in the English and Education program. You'll notice that that second sentence is passive. I could have said, I have a new favorite mug. Graduate students in the English and Education program gave it to me. But you'll notice that when I take that second sentence and put it into the active, there's suddenly a jump. I was talking about the mug, and now I'm talking about the graduate students who gave it to me. In the passive, I'm talking about the mug. I have a new favorite mug. It was given to me, and we get that continuity across sentences. So that's one reason the passive voice may be rhetorically effective. Sometimes, as we've talked about, we don't know the agent, and the passive is very helpful here. Think about some of the terrible news we hear, where reporters need to be careful not to assume agents before we know who the agents are. An example like, 2 people were shot last night, or the store was set on fire sometime early this morning. You need passive constructions there. Then there is scientific writing. Scientific writing tends to follow a set of unique, or at least unusual, but I'm going to call them unique conventions in terms of how articles are structured overall. For example, you have a methods section, a results section, and then a discussion section. And the passive has become more and more conventionalized in this register of scientific writing, than in many others. Let's think about the description of an experiment. When you think about an experiment, in fact, researchers are doing most of the actions. They're taking the sample, they're putting it in a petri dish, they're adding whatever they're adding, and so on. If we told the experiment like a story, there'd be a lot of people involved. We'd be saying things like, we took the sample and we put it in a petri dish and then we added this to it. But certainly at this point, that no longer sounds very scientific to us. That sounds more like a story. Instead, let's try making it sound more scientific. The sample was placed in the petri dish, and then X was added to the sample. Clearly, there were human agents putting things in that petri dish and adding things to it, but they disappeared from the grammar. The human agents are invisible or at least very marginalized. The specimens themselves take center stage in that description, which is important. I mean, in science, often we do want people to focus on what the experiment was about, not the people who were doing it. And so the passive can help there. The passive can also make this scientific experiment sound more objective, more scientific. That can be a really good thing, but it is important for us to remember that it can also hide, or at least obscure from view, make marginal those human decisions in an experiment, and perhaps the bias that can happen with an experiment, and the uncertainty that is part of humans doing experiments. Here is a great example of the passive voice in scientific writing from the Journal of Experimental Biology. It's from an article called Biomechanical Control of Vocal Plasticity in the Echolocating Bat. Yes, we're going to talk about bats. Here is an excerpt from the article. 6 individuals of adult Philostomus discolor, 3 males and 3 females, were tested in an echo and sound attenuated acoustic chamber. Okay, so they were tested clearly by people, but the people are not part of the grammar. Let me continue with the passage. During the experiment, 2 bats were tested simultaneously, with bats held individually in pyramidal mesh cages. So now the bats are being held, again by humans, but they're just being held. Onwards. Bats were assigned to the same pairs throughout the experiment. Sound recording and noise playback were synchronized through an audio interface. Bat vocalizations were continuously sampled at 192 kilohertz. Right? So we can see they're being sampled, somebody's sampling them, but we're not told who. And the excerpt ends with, and it's talking about specific data, these data were saved to hard disk. Obviously, there's a person doing that saving, but we just know that the data were saved. This passage now strikes us as just typical scientific writing. Those vocalizations were continuously sampled. The data were saved. The bats were tested. But as I noted, scientific writing doesn't have to happen that way. There are rhetorical reasons it's happening. It allows us to focus on the bats and what's happening to the bats. It also doesn't allow us necessarily, or doesn't help us imagine the humans who are holding the bats. Scientific writing has not always worked that way. To show you what I mean, I'm going to give you a passage from the 18th century. This is a passage from the physiologist John Hunter from a work in 1775. I'm pulling this excerpt from work by Dwight Atkinson, who's been looking at the history of scientific writing. You'll see that Hunter is using some passive, very object-centered language at the beginning of this passage, but then the language shifts. Here's the passage. The first experiment was made on 2 carp. Right? So you see the passive. The experiment was made on 2 carp. Here, and now I will continue with Hunter. They were put into a glass vessel with common river water, and the vessel put into freezing mixture. The water did not freeze fast enough, and therefore, to make it freeze sooner, we put in as much cooled snow as to make the whole thick. The snow round the carp melted. We put in more snow, which melted also, and this was repeated several times till we grew tired. I love this passage because it's so wonderfully human. You can imagine the people taking the snow and packing it around the carp until they get tired. We probably would not let a student now write up a lab report this way, but it is important to remember that the conventions of scientific writing are something that we've all come to agree on over time. You see Hunter, who has this mixture of the more passive, object-centered language, along with this much more narrative language, where we can see him and his fellow experimenters experimenting with the carp. There are a few other passive phrases that are now commonplaces in academic writing, beyond scientific writing, that don't typically get edited out as ineffective passives. These would be passives like, it could be argued, or other relevant factors must be considered. It could be argued is a way we introduce counter-arguments into our writing as part of defending our own claims. These arguments may have been argued by others, or they may be hypothetical, but it doesn't actually matter who argued them. We need to get them into our writing as part of constructing our own argument and addressing possible counterarguments. With X must be considered, it can be a solution to what I call the abstract we problem in academic writing. If you were going to make this active, you'd probably need to say something like, we must consider other relevant factors. And my question is, Who is we? The authors? The author and the readers? All researchers in the field? All researchers in the field and the readers? So here I would say, pick your poison. You can use the passive and say these things must be considered, or you can choose the abstract we must consider them. Both of those options present some stylistic issues. While we're talking about the passive, let's talk about a variant that doesn't use be, but instead uses get. For example, my car got sideswiped in the parking lot, or she got arrested. These get passives feel, I think for most of us, much more colloquial, not something we're going to write in formal settings that we wouldn't tend to say, the test tube got warmed to 100 degrees. We would say it was warmed. In addition to being more colloquial, get passives may also mean slightly differently from be passives. They may carry a difference in connotation. It could be about the responsibility of the grammatical subject. For example, Mario got fired. I think for many of us, that means something slightly different from Mario was fired, at least in terms of connotations. Mario got fired. I think Mario has to take a little more responsibility for getting fired. It's like Mario got himself fired. The get passive may also reflect the attitude of the speaker toward the event, perhaps expressing adversity or benefit. For example, my car got hit. And I think that is my own sense of adversity, that my car got hit. Or let's say I'm trying to express sympathy for someone. She got cheated. That expresses my sympathy for her. Get passives, which can still feel quite colloquial, are older than you might guess. They're first attested in the mid to late 17th century, although they're only sporadic in that period. And it's really not until the late 18th century that they take off. So the get passive is in place in the grammar before another change starts to take place. And we'll end the lecture with this change. The 19th century witnessed the rise of the passive progressive in English. What is that? It is the passive that is in progress. So it is a sentence like, the house is being built. Now, this sentence is completely mundane now, but people hated it when it came into the language in the 19th century. Here is George P. Marsh in Lectures on the English Language, published in 1863, and he's talking about this new passive progressive, which he describes this way. The clumsy and unidiomatic continuing present of the passive voice, which originating not in the sound common sense of the people, but in the brain of some grammatical pretender, has widely spread and threatens to establish itself as another solecism in addition to the many which our syntax already presents. The phrase, the house is being built, for the house is building, is an awkward neologism, an attempt at the artificial improvement of the language in a point which needed no amendment. I think this criticism can seem so funny to us now because a sentence like, the house is being built, doesn't even seem worthy of notice, let alone criticism. But criticism it got. Here is David Booth in An Analytical Dictionary of the English Language, which was published in 1830, so a few decades earlier. And he writes, for some time past, the bridge is being built, the tunnel is being excavated, and other expressions of a like kind have pained the eye and stunned the ear. What's interesting here is that in an earlier edition of that book, published in 1805, he doesn't mention the passive progressive. Clearly, it wasn't in such wide circulation that it was on his radar. Richard Grant White also addressed the passive progressive in 1869. He described it as the worst of, and here I quote him, those intruders in language which, about 70 or 80 years ago, began to affront the eye, torment the ear, and assault the common sense of the speaker of plain and idiomatic English. But Richard Grant White had to admit in the end that the passive progressive, and here again I'll quote, seems to many persons to be of established respectability. Now, it is, of course, completely respectable now to use the passive progressive. In fact, we think it sounds a little odd not to use it and to say the house is building instead of the house is being built. Did people really say the house is building as a passive? Yes, they did. Let me give you an example from Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, which you may or may not have noticed if you've read the novel. Here's the sentence. The clock struck 10 while the trunks were carrying down. This is not how we'd now say that. We would say while the trunks were being carried down. Here's a second example. This one's from Samuel Richardson's novel, Sir Charles Grandison, published in 1753. And this example is cited in a very nice discussion of the passive progressive on the blog Grammarphobia. Here are the two sentences from the work. Tea was preparing. Sir Charles took his own seat next Lord L., whom he set into talk of Scotland. Tea was preparing. This way of doing the passive progressive, the bags were carrying down, tea was preparing, now sounds funny to us, while the tea is being prepared sounded funny to people in the 19th century. All of this is a good reminder of how grammar changes over time, as well as how what is considered standard and abominable, an assault to the eye and an affront to the ear, can also change over time. Speaking of which, does it affront your ear when you hear Apple's slogan, "Think different"? If so, you're not alone, and the next lecture is for you.